My name is Reva Kibort. I was born Warsaw, Poland, March 4th, 1933. My maiden name was Reva Mendelbaum.
What are some of your earliest memories as a small child?
My earliest memories are, I remember as a little girl Passover, and I know that I always used to fall asleep at the Seder. I always remember being waken up as a little girl. I remember that one very, very vividly. My earliest memory is that I remember my father made me a pair of navy blue shoes with little red pom-poms. And I must have worn those shoes till the war started. And I remember how much I loved those little shoes, because at those times you only used to get new clothing for holidays. For Passover or for Rosh Hashanah you used to get new clothes. And those were some of my early memories as a little girl. I also remember as a little girl not being a very good eater, and constantly my mother complaining that I didn't eat very well or good. I was just not a good eater. And whenever I did eat, they would give me like Kaiser rolls with a lot of butter on it, and I would take the butter and eat on top and throw the rest away behind the shutters, behind the shutters. And my mother would always find the bread behind there because I just wouldn't eat it.
What was your house like?
What was my house like? I don't remember too well about the house. I know that we all lived in one big room, and that's all I really remember. I don't have too many memories of the house.
Besides falling asleep at the Seder table, do you remember anything about how you celebrated Jewish holidays?
I remember also as a little girl going to the synagogue and seeing a lot of children like on Simchas Torah with little flags and apples on top. I don't remember per se to say that I went to shul. That I cannot remember at all. But I do remember on Simchas Torah where I would see these little children walking, marching to the synagogues with little flags with apples on top. And that must have been Simchas Torah. I am sure that my mother must have made something special on every Friday, because we ate special food on Friday. And I remember sitting around a table and with my sisters and brother, but other than that, not very much.
What were some of the special foods?
Well, I remember my mother...
Never mind. No, I did not say that. I did not say.
I only remember my mother making meatballs that were excellent. She used to make the most delicious barley soup with dumplings in them that they were absolutely out of this world. And I don't know what else she made. She made delicious chicken soup with rice and with lokshen, and that's about all I remember.
What were your parents like?
What were my parents like? That's a good question. I remember my father being a very tall man, and he had red hair, reddish curly hair, and my mother was medium height. My father must have been about 6 feet tall. My mother must have been about 5'4" maybe, and she had dark hair, slim woman, and I don't remember anything else. I know my father was a very loving father. I remember that I know he loved the kids very, very much, And he was a very, very hard-working man, and he made sure that, I suppose, that we behaved ourselves. I don't know.
What was school like?
There's a big question, Stacy, with school. You know, I only started school 2 weeks before the war started. That's a funny story. I should tell this. Before I started school, I had to have a vaccination. And my mother could not go with me, I guess, so they sent my sister Hannah with me, being that Hannah was the oldest. And I remember going to the school to get a vaccination, and they vaccinated me, and then they vaccinated Hannah. And for the life of me, till today, I still don't understand why Hannah was vaccinated too. It was the funniest thing. I vaguely remember the school, what it looked like, because I know that all the children wore black uniforms and white Peter Pan collars. We all had to have slippers in order to get into the school, because the school had the most magnificent hardwood floors. They were just beautiful floors, very, very lustrous floors. And all the children had to wear uniforms and special shoes in order to go into the school. Other than that, I really don't remember much about the school at all, because I never went to school. When the Germans came in and they announced a few months later maybe, or a year later, that the Jews were not allowed to go to school, and that was the end of my education in Poland. So I really don't have any memories of that at all, other than what I just told you.
What was your extended family like?
You mean other than my brothers and sisters?
Grandparents?
I remember I had a grandmother, my mother's my grandma, Suralaya. I remember her very well. She was a very short little stout lady. She was very, very good to the grandchildren. And then I remember my father's sister Hannah. He had a sister Hannah. He had a sister Reva. He had a sister Chela, which is in Israel now. And he had my uncle Yerme, which was in Texas, which he died. And then my uncle Jack. And then my Aunt Reva had twin daughters or boys, twin girls. She had twin girls, and she also had two boys and two girls, my Aunt Reva. And my Auntie Hannah had a boy and a girl. The boy's name was Herschel, and the little girl was Chayala. And Chayala, till today, always will haunt me as long as I live. I think she must have been my age. I'm not sure how old she was. But she was a very, very pretty little girl with blonde curls. And this was in the ghetto. And of course, at that time, everybody was starving, you know, from starvation. And there was something wrong with her leg. It looked like a terrible infection on her leg, which the whole leg was sort of open. It was like an open wound. And of course, she died in the ghetto, or they took her away, I don't know. But she will always haunt me from the ghetto days yet. And then... oh, okay.
What do you remember about Masha and Golda?
Well, like I said to you, Stacy, I do not remember Goldela at all. Whatever I remember is mainly from what I had heard from my sisters and my brother. I do not remember her at all. I remember them saying that we had a little sister who was very, very sick and that she died, but I do not remember her at all. As far as my sister Masha, I remember her not too well either, actually. I remember what she looked like, but my memories of her are not that strong that I could really tell you. I know that she had dark hair, and she had, of course, a problem with walking. She had one leg was shorter than the other, and she was a very, very sweet girl. Other than that, I really have no memories of her.
Do you remember anything about what you would do as a family after dinner? If you played any games, if your father read, if you listened to the radio, or...
I have no recollection of that at all. Not at all. I don't remember that at all, what we did. I would assume after dinner you washed up and you went to bed. You know, you got to realize, Stacy, that we were not well-to-do people. We were poverty people, you know. We were poor, very poor. And even though we were poor in money, monetary, but we had a very strong families and a very strong ties and a loving family. We all loved each other. My mother and father loved each other. But monetary, we had nothing. So...
Were other members of your family basically the same monetarily or financially?
You mean my parents' family? Some were better and some were not, you know, it depends. For instance, my mother's sister, the one that we lived with in the ghetto, she was very wealthy. So, my Aunt Ethel was her name. She was a very wealthy woman. And yet, on the other hand, there were some who weren't so wealthy. So, you know, it was a mixture.
How old were you when the war started?
7? I think I was 7 years old. Yes, from 33 to 39 is 7. I was 7 years old.
And what do you remember early on about the war?
Oh, wow. What do I remember? I remember that hearing bombings, you know, the bombs were coming. I remember that. And I also remember running into the cellar. People were running into the cellars when the bombs were falling. Because, you know, you didn't want to be left in the house, in the rooms. So we had to run into below the street level. And I remember being grabbed.
Okay.
What do you remember about the beginning of the war? Where you were, who you were with?
Well, I don't know, the beginning of the war, all I remember is hearing sirens and bombs and people running and everybody being afraid because you were, you know, you could get killed with the bombs. And I remember, like I said, people were running into places to hide so the bombs would not hit you. And I also always remember being chased, I mean not chased, dragged, always. Somebody was dragging me along. And I also remember houses being in flames, you know, seeing a lot. Well, my mother must have been schlepping me all the time. And yeah, that's what I remember to start with. When the Germans occupied Poland in September of 1939. And at that time, it was pretty frightening for me, and I'm sure it must have been frightening for my mother and everybody else.
What do you remember next? What were some of your experiences early in the war?
Well, I remember when the German soldiers, when the bombing finally did subside, I remember that there were lines of people and that the German soldiers were dishing out soups and all the people were waiting in lines. And at that time, who would have thought what would have happened to all of us, what these Germans would have caused? It was very, very unbelievable that anything like this could have happened, because at that point it just seemed like on any other occupation army came into a strange country, and that's what they were trying to do. And then hell broke loose, and 2 years you would have never recognized that same town. Well, after that things sort of settled down, and my father, of course, was killed in 1939 of September was Erev Rosh Hashanah, he was killed. And we still were living with my aunt. We were at that time. And I really have not too many memories about that, about my father being killed. All I remember is most of the stories, what my sisters have told me. And other than that, I really don't remember.
So at this point, were you still living with your Aunt Ethel in Warsaw?
Yeah, we were living with her. And I understand one of the reasons that my father left when they were bombing the city, I understand. Now that too I don't remember, but Hannah told me about it, and everybody else has told me that my father was going out to look for them because they had gone back to our old home, our original house, to open up the windows and get ready for Yontif because Yontif was coming. And meanwhile, the Germans were still bombing. The city. They were still bombing, and my father was trying to run, I guess, to look for them. And this is when they thought that he had gotten killed on the street. And then I understand that they found him. That my aunt, my father's sister Hannah, came to the house. And my mother looked at her, she already knew what was happening. She sort of had a feeling that they must have found him someplace dead. And that's exactly what happened. And I really don't remember that at all. I just don't remember that.
What's the next thing that you remember?
Well, the next thing I remember living in the ghetto and how terrible it was. How the starvation was, the Germans were trying to cut us off from everybody. They organized the ghetto. They built a wall around the area where the ghetto was supposed to be. I believe it must have been a 2-story high wall. And on top of it was glass. So anybody who tried to escape couldn't anyway escape because they would probably kill themselves and cutting themselves to pieces. I remember also in the ghetto the starvation, the poverty, the dirt, the disease. I remember living in the ghetto and being very, very hungry. And I also know that when I used to ask for food, we had absolutely nothing to eat. My mother would say to me all the time to sing. So I would sing. She said you would forget that you're hungry. If you sing, you forget that you're hungry. And I also remember having a rubber ball of some kind and going out in the courtyard to play with it. Even though my stomach was being torn apart by hunger, I just played and played till the pain would go away, I guess. And I also remember finding on the streets dead corpses, naked dead corpses every day. You could just see them everywhere you went. They were on the street. Young children, old people, women, men, no matter what. And people would take off some of their clothing in order to sell it or keep it for themselves because it was very cold and there was no heat, no fuel. And that's about as bad as it can be. And then I also remember at one point where we had to move into another place in the ghetto. It was an attic-like. And I remember that all of us were sick. All my sisters were sick. And we were all sick, and my mother took care of all of us. And it was just, I think it's typhus it was called. It was just rampage in the ghetto. And the sanitary was so bad. It was just awful. I mean, it's very difficult to sitting here right now and describing it then, what it was like. I think the ghetto, it will always haunt me too, to seeing those faces, those emaciated children with the big bellies and the red hair and the eyes sticking out. And yet I was very, very fortunate because my sisters smuggled and they were able to bring food into the ghetto. So I am sure, I am almost positive that had it not been for Mindel and Eda and Mark and Hannah with the smuggling, I think all of us would have probably died before even the Germans got to us. And due to their courage and to their guts and to their nerve, because after all, you know, they were not, they were pretending that they were non-Jews, and if anybody would have caught them, they would have killed them on sight, I'm sure, any German. So I think that we all have to be a little bit grateful to all of them, because they really took their own lives in their own hands, all of them, all four of them. And I also remember one day in the ghetto, the Germans came in to look for people. They were grabbing people off the streets, and what they were trying to do is get all the, first they started out with the men, the young men, then they started out with the middle-aged men, then they started out with the young women, and slowly but surely the ghetto was becoming less and less people. And they were taking the people out of the ghettos, claiming or telling them that they're going to work. But of course, unfortunately, none of them came back. And I remember one particular time I was in the ghetto with my mother and my sister Masha, and the Germans were coming in, and my mother told me to hide. And I think she hid herself underneath the bed, and my sister Masha hid herself someplace else. And I went into a basket where you kept dirty laundry. I think it was a rattan type basket at my aunt's house, and I sort of hid in there, and the German soldiers came in with the bayonet, and he poked it in with his bayonet, and I must have probably stopped breathing at that point, and he did not find me. And I still believe now, somehow or another, that I have a star. My father has always watched over me. I've always believed that. And I think that day I remember very vividly. I also remember another day in the ghetto where Eda came home from the farm to look for us, because at that point Eda had heard that they were killing all the Jews. So Eda came home. My memory is not very, very clear on that. I do remember going with Eda across the wall into the Aryan side, and Eda taking us. I remember that my mother told us that we should go ahead first, and that she would follow with my sister Masha. And by the time we got to the other side, they had taken the whole ghetto. They evacuated the whole ghetto. That was probably either June or July of 1942. And of course, that was the last time I saw my mom and my sister. What else? I remember also another very clear memory when my sister Hannah and I were on the other side of the ghetto. We had gone over to the Polish side. Evidently these Polish people knew my sisters from smuggling, and we came over there to stay during the night, thinking that they would protect us. And in the middle of night, I understand their husband, one of the men, had gotten drunk. He was drunk, and he had come after me and after Hanan with a hatchet, and he kept yelling, dirty Jew, you know. And all I remember is Hannah schlepping me, and we were running out of that house like God only knows how fast we could possibly run. We ran, and on the way I remember tearing both my knees, and my knees were bleeding, and there was nothing we could do about it. And we stayed in this cornfield. We ran into a cornfield, and we stayed that night till it became light. And from that point on, my memory is not too clear either, because I think that we went to a train station because we were hoping to go to another town where my mother was born and my father, and hoping that there would be family there. And I remember sitting on a train, with my sister Hanan and all of them. I think at that point we were all together, I think. I'm not sure. And I know that I could not open my mouth because I did not speak Polish. I could only speak Yiddish. And there were German soldiers all over on the train, and I didn't say one word to them at all. I just sat there like a mute, pretending that I was a mute. And it was a very, very tough day. I mean, it had to be very, very frightening for me. I cannot sit here now after 50 years and tell you how I felt then. I don't remember how I felt then. How does any 7-year-old child feel when fear stares in its face? It had to be very, very traumatic for a 7-year-old.
After the train, what's the next thing you remember?
After the train. After the train, I think what we tried to do is go back to the places where my grandma lived, I think, or my aunt, and we found out that all the Jews had been gathered to the center of the city. And when we got there, none of them were there either. And somebody had said that they were gathered up in a... Somebody had said that all the Jews were gathered in a certain area. I think they had like an army, what are they called, armories. And we could not get into the camp where they took these people. Now, I don't remember that either. I really don't. I remember it was night time and somebody took us into the camp, to this area where they were there. But I do not have memories. Certain memories are just completely, either I blocked them out or I honestly cannot remember them. I really don't. The next thing I remember is being in that camp, in a camp where they organized it, with barracks.
Is there a name of the camp?
Demblin, it was Demblin. And that was already 1942. And I remember being in that camp. And in that camp, they... You know, it was a slave labor camp, but I was too young to go to work. I was mainly in the barracks, you know. And my sister Hanna and Mindel and Era and all of them went to work, but I didn't. I stayed in the camp. And we were in that camp for 2 years. I still think that we were very, very, considering now, knowing what I know now, what the Holocaust was like, considering now, I think that we were very, very lucky and fortunate that we were in those kind of camps, because I would have never survived any other kind of camp. If I would have been in any Auschwitz or Buchenwald or Bergen-Belsen or any of the other camps, I don't think I would have survived because I was too young. I was very lucky that both camps were slave labor camps. And you might call it sheer luck, or you might call it destiny, or whatever you want to call it. But I'm a firm believer that I survived for a reason. I honestly believe that after every tragedy, after every Holocaust that exists, somebody has to survive in order to tell it.
During those 2 years, do you remember anything from day to day? What you did?
Not really.
When you woke up, and when you went to sleep, or what you do in between when all the
I remember.
people were gone?
No, I don't really remember what I did in that camp. I don't remember because I was hidden a lot of the times in the barracks. You know, and the dirt, you know, the way we slept on the bunks, you know, with the straw and the lice and the bugs. That I remember very well, you know, the dirt, and no, I really don't.
Do you remember what you were given to eat?
I remember they gave us a piece of bread, you know, maybe a wedge, a piece of bread and some soup, and we shared, you know, whatever we had. We were. One good thing about all of us, that we all shared no matter what we had. Even if I wouldn't have gotten any bread at all, my sisters would have shared with me. And we were very, very fortunate. We were very lucky that we survived, all of us. But you know what? Even at the worst moments in our lives, at the lowest point in our lives, we always had a feeling that we are going to survive and that we are going to make it. And we always used to talk about it, especially in the other camp, in Częstochow, that we're always going to survive and make it. We had this feeling, because an awful lot of people in our camps, the ones that gave up, the ones that said, I can't take this anymore, I can't do it anymore, those are the ones who died. You know, the will to live is so strong that somehow or another, if you're lucky at all, then you make it.
So you were in Demblin for 2 years, and then...
In Demblin we were for 2 years, and then of course as the Russian army was approaching, the Germans were beginning to lose the war. They could see that they're having problems. So they decided to take us to another camp, to Częstochow. And they put us on trains. And they were about maybe 20 children, I would say. I thought that there were less, but Uncle Mark told me the other day that there were more children. And I was actually among one of the oldest at the time with the children. And we were transferred to the camp to Częstochow. We arrived, and then they separated the men and the women and, of course, the children. And I was holding on to this little baby which had originally been born in the other camp, a 6-month-old little, I can't remember if it was a boy or a girl, but that doesn't make any difference. And I was holding on to the baby, and the German soldier yelled to me to throw the baby away. In other words, put the baby down, you know, just like that. But he talked to me in German. And I held on to the baby. I didn't want to do anything with the baby. But eventually I did put the baby away. And then the next thing I remember, I did not see any more Hanan and Ed and Mindel anymore, or Mark, because they were marched away to be cleaned, to the showers. And they had all taken off their old clothing from the other camps. And I remember when the German soldier told me to run, after I had dropped the child, he told me to run. And I don't know, for that split second, I think the German soldier, either I reminded him of his own child, or maybe a grandchild. For one split second, that German only saw a small little blonde girl, and he told her to run. And I ran. But what did I do? I ran into a pile with dirty clothes, and I hid there till it got dark. And then after it got dark, I went into the barracks where I found my 3 sisters. And of course, when the women saw me, they all sort of started grabbing at me and screaming at me and yelling at me, what happened to the kids and what happened to the kids? And I was smart enough to tell them that I really don't know what happened to the children. And of course, what they did to the children, they lined them up in a pit, all around a pit, and they shot them. And another soldier, I think, threw a hand grenade, and that was the end of the children.
Could you see what was going on, or did you hear it?
No, I could see it from the distance, from where I was in the pile of the clothes. And afterwards, camp settled down, you know. I lived in the camp for another, from 1942 to 45, we were in that camp.
One quick question. How did you find the barracks? Because it sounded like it was a fairly large camp. How did you know how to find your sisters?
Well, you know what? I just asked that same question Ada and Hannah the other day. How in heaven's name did I know which barrack to run to? Now there's a dispute going on here. Hannah says one thing and Ada says another thing. They claim that it was a Jewish policeman who told me where to go. Now I don't remember any Jewish policeman, or anybody for that matter, or a guard. I only remember the German soldier. And how I knew, it's a mystery. I just found it out myself, Stacy. I do not know how I knew how to get into that barrack. Why didn't I go to a different barrack? I just don't know. And the camp, and of course in Częstochow we worked in ammunition factory. We were making bullets.
Did you work?
Yeah, I remember going to the factory. Yeah, I remember picking up bullets. And but Częstochow was already a much tougher camp. It was not quite as easy as the Demblin camp. There, the soldiers were much more. They were meaner. They were. It was terrible. It was a terrible situation in that camp. And I also remember my sister Hannah once getting beaten up from one of the supervisors, a German lady that supervised at the factory. Hannah had a terrible beating. They beat her. And I remember having these awful sores on my feet. They were just, evidently they must have been either frozen, you know, no, from frostbite or whatever. But I remember I had horrible sores on my feet and wearing these rags all over them. And again, the same thing, the dirt, the lice and the bugs, and it was terrible. It was absolutely awful. Just terrible.
Were you ever beaten by a German?
No, never. Never. I don't think if a German really truly would have gotten a hold of me, I don't think I would have survived. I really don't think so. I don't know. It really is a mystery till today why they did not take me with those 20 children. Why that German soldier decided for me to run. I don't know.
When you worked at the ammunition factory, do you remember exactly what you did?
No, I remember, like I said, I remember picking up bullets, the bullets that fell out of the machines. And I also remember, I think, washing the bullets. They had to wash them in a soap and water of some kind. So we did that. And, but now going back and looking back at it, you know, I don't remember where Era was, and I don't remember where Mindel was. I only remember where Hannah was at that factory. And my brother worked with the men in another side. But what one thing, I don't know. It's hard to remember 50 years going back. You know, it's very hard. I thought it was going to be a cinch for me to sit here and tell you all of that and remember it all. But I really, to be perfectly honest, I really don't. I don't. A lot of the memories, or some of that will be, hopefully my sisters will tell them to you all, because they remember evidently much more than I do. Now I'm beginning to see what the mind of a 7-year-old is. You just, you try to not remember, probably.
Did you remember meeting other people in the camps? Did you have, obviously you didn't have friends your own age because you were
No, there were a couple girls who were the same age as I was. There was a little girl the same age, Sarah was her name, I think Rochel was Sarah. And, but no, there was no playtime for me. There was no, I did not have a childhood. This is one thing. Somebody asked me a question the other day, and she asked me that question, what I resent most of all. And I said, what I resent most of it is that I never had a childhood. I was robbed of being a child. That's what I was robbed. Of playing outside or doing normal things what a child would do. And I didn't. I did not have those things. Meeting, well, you always knew the people in camp because the quarters, the sleeping quarters were so tight. Everybody slept in one barrack, in one bunk, you know, on the bunk beds. So of course you had to know the people. If you would ask me now who these people were, I don't remember them. I couldn't point them out to you or tell you who they are. I can't. Maybe my sisters can, but I can't.
Do you have any memories of certain incidences that happened at the camp at Częstochow?
What happened in Czestochow? A lot of things happened in Czestochow, but offhand, I really can't tell you.
Do you remember your liberation?
Yeah, I remember the liberation, yes. I think, at least I think I do.
Tell us what you remember.
Well, there again, we go back to bombing again. My whole life, all I hear is bombs. I remember being very, very cold. It was January 1945. It was extremely cold. And it was during the night we heard bombing. And of course, a lot of the older people, I think, people knew that something was going on, that either the Germans, the Russians were coming and the Germans were fleeing, or something was going on. But one thing that sticks out in my mind mostly was a courageous, very courageous thing that my sister Hannah did. Because had her luck been any different, my sister Hannah probably would not be alive today. Had the Germans had maybe one more day of being able to take out their transport with the people and taking them to different camps, maybe my sister Hannah and Mark and Etta would not be alive today. I remember before the bombing started, the Germans again were being panicky. They were panicky, and they were trying to evacuate the camps, trying to move the camp to further north. And they called up names and the people to go. And I remember my sister Hannah telling me that if they'll call my name, that I should not go, I should stand still, and that she would go out, which she did. And that was very, very courageous on her part, because she did not know at that point at time, she probably knew that they were taking him out to die, you know. It was that's exactly what they were doing. But we were very, very lucky that the Russians were coming quicker than the Germans were able to flee. So I remember that they took Hannah and Mark and Etta out, and Mindel and I were left behind in the camp. And the bombs, they were still bombing the camps. Well, they were bombing the whole city. And I remember sitting in the barrack with Mindel, and some other women were still in the camp, in the barracks. My sister Mindel said to me, "Why don't you run out and see if you can get some food? Run into the kitchen." Because everybody at this point knew that the Germans were already leaving. So here the bombs were falling, and she said to me, "You run out and go see if you can get some food." And me, like a fool, ran. I was running, like crawling on my stomach, because they were still shooting. And I ran into the kitchen, and of course there was nothing there left anymore. Everybody had looted and robbed, and everybody took everything out. And then I remember coming back into the barracks, and I remember sitting freezing to death because it was so cold, and we all huddled together, whoever was left in the barrack, huddled together and talking what's going to happen and what's going to happen, and maybe freedom is coming and all of that. And then the next thing I knew, it was morning, and the camp was liberated. We were liberated by the Russians the following morning. And then Mindel and I, well, not just Mindel and I, we all went out. We ran out like animals, all the people. It was like being caged up in cages, and everybody ran out of the camps like animals, like tigers, because you didn't actually know where you're running, and you really didn't know what was waiting for you. But I remember then seeing Hannah and Mark and Etta coming back, because the boxcars were, they didn't have a chance to take him, so they all came back to the camp. And the next thing I remember, walking with Etta, we were walking out of the camps. God only knows where we were going, but evidently, according to my sister Hannah, she said to us that my mother had always said to her that no matter whoever survived, that we should all meet at a certain spot in Demblin, which was my grandma's hometown, and my mother's too, I guess. And according to Hannah, she said that we all have to go back, that this is where we should really go back. And I remember coming out of the camps and walking with Etta, shivering to death. It was so cold. We were so hungry. And they were still bombing. The city was still being bombed. And the next thing I know, I'm walking on this road, this dirt road, like the soldiers usually walk. And again, I heard bombs above us. And evidently a bomb fell and it hit the ground. And Etta gave me such a schlep. She pulled me so hard that both of us fell into the foxhole, the soldiers where the soldiers would be hiding. And we both fell in, and then Hannah, which was walking just a little bit ahead of us, also fell. And of course, till much later, we found out that Hannah had been wounded. A shrapnel piece of the bomb had grazed her not forehead, her head actually, and she was bleeding. And there was this other young woman who was cut to pieces. She was just cut open completely. I'll never forget that scene, ever. And we were all walking, and all I could see is blood along the trail because it was winter. It was January, full of snow. And we finally were able to get into a barn, a farmhouse. And when we got there, we found a Russian medic, a Russian soldier, a medic. And so he was able to fix Hannah's wound. He cleaned her head, and he took a sheet. I think he asked the woman to give him a sheet of some kind, and he covered her head. But this poor woman, this young, very young woman, must have been maybe 20 or even younger, I don't know, was sitting there begging the soldier to kill her. He just begged her because she was completely, her whole stomach was exposed. You could just see the kishkas inside, and eventually she died there. And from that point on, I think we stayed overnight at that farm, and then we decided to walk. And I think it took us a few weeks till we finally found our destination, back to Demblin. And during the walk, of course, there was a lot of hunger and starvation. I remember looking for food in the garbage to look, if we could find any food to eat, what the Polish people had. But the Polish people too were poor at that time. They had nothing, and we really were afraid to tell them that we were Jews too, even though they must have guessed anyway. So we walked till we finally came to Demblin, back to Demblin. And when we got there, of course, everything was gone. There were no Jews. Everybody was gone. There were the Russians there since they liberated the city. And we found a very old house with, I think half of the roof was torn off. And there were a few other people coming with us, people from the same town, had gone back to Demblin. And there was nothing for us to eat there either. We had to, the Russian soldiers gave us some food. And we slept all on the floor, cuddled together for warmth. And I don't remember how long we were there. I don't think we were there very long. And then somebody came and told us that there's, next to the city, Lublin, which is not far from Demblin, that there were some Jews left, and that there all the Jews are being organized there. So we came to Lublin, and I think my Mindel probably would know more than I would because she went there. And I don't know how long I stayed in that house. And no, from Lublin, we came to Lublin, and right away a cousin of mine, which is no longer living, he died a few years ago. He used to live in California, Froyam. His name was Froyam Stern. He had found out that there's an orphanage in Lublin. And I understand, I have no idea the arrangement, who made the arrangement, what, I have no idea. But the three of us were put into that orphanage, Mark and Etta and myself.
And how old were you at this point?
Oh, 5. Let's see, I was already 12 years old at that point. So, and then we lived in the orphanage for quite a while. This was January. Then May 1st, the war was over. This was still going on. The war was still going on when we were there. And but how we got from Dublin to Lublin was we went on a train, but this time we had to sit on the outside of the train because we had no money. And you see sometimes, you know, from the countryside, these people get on the train, on top of the train, on the sides, and this is exactly how we travel. But you got to realize this was winter. We had no clothing. We were very, very cold. But when you're young, your resilience is strong. You survive. And the will to live is very strong. And you fight on. You keep going. And with me, it was, you know, I was always evidently taken care of. Somebody always watched over me. I was very lucky that my sisters watched me. Because if I didn't have them, then I don't know what would have happened to a 12-year-old little girl. I think I probably would have ended up living in the orphanage eventually, and I don't know.
So you said you stayed in the orphanage in Lublin until May, when the war was over?
No, I stayed longer. I stayed longer. But the war was over in May. I remember that they had parades, and I was marching in the parade. I was in the first line with all the little kids because we were so happy that the war is over. And life in the orphanage was not bad because you had other children who had survived, and it was almost like a family. Everybody was equal. There was nobody any different than you. So life in the orphanage was, I don't remember being mistreated in the orphanage at all. I just don't remember that. But at the same time in Lublin, my sister Hanne lived in Lublin too. And meanwhile, she had gotten married. And I used to come and visit all the time, them, walk to the house where she lived with Sheehan. And I know she always used to say that. He always remembered what I used to do. I used to come over to the house and I would say to them, okay, I'm going home already. I used to say that all the time. Because according to what Hannah tells me is that I wanted them to give me something, money or whatever. And every time I say, okay, I'm going. So I used to walk barefoot. And on our way from the orphanage to my sister's house, there used to be a market, a food market, like a farmer's market. And Uncle Shear would give me some money and I would buy myself cherries. I love big cherries. Or else chocolate. And he always, till the day Shia died, whenever I would come to visit Uncle Shia, he would always give me a candy bar. Deep down, I think, in his mind, he always kept me as a little girl that he knew. Always, always, whenever I would come to their house, he would give me a candy bar. He said, I saved you some chocolate. I think he always sort of thought of me as that little Rivala, you know. And that was my life in Lublin. Till everybody started talking about the Jews. There was a question at the time about Israel. People were talking about going to Israel. People were talking about going to America. And our kibbutz, our orphanage was being transferred. They were transferring the further north, taking away from Lublin. And evidently Edda and Mark went. They took them first, and they left me behind. And I had this discussion the other day with Edda. I said to her, how could you have left me behind? How could you have left me, you know? I mean, it was terrible. How could you do that to me? She said, well, we knew that you would follow, otherwise we wouldn't have left you behind and all of that. But just the same, they did leave me behind. But luckily enough for Edda, there was a woman who came looking for her own daughter at the other orphanage, I guess, where Edda and Mark were. And Edda had asked this woman to please bring my little sister. I have a little sister in the orphanage, and please, could you please bring my little sister with me? So this woman came back to the orphanage to look for her little girl, which she was there, and she took me too. And we had to travel through the Polish border, through the Czechoslovakian border, because we could not travel legally, because we were people without a country. We had nowhere to go. We were just displaced people. So I remember smuggling through the borders at night going through barbed wires or going through stations. And once I remember being questioned in Prague, in Czechoslovakia. This German, soldier asked me a question at the train station, what we were doing there. And this woman, of course, explained to him. She talked to him in German. And somehow or another, he let us go through, and we smuggled ourselves through from one border to the other, till we got, this is already, I thought this was when we got to Germany already. But I don't think, I think I've got the stories a little bit mixed up. I think Eda will have to get me straightened out on that. I'm not quite sure there exactly what happened. I'm not sure.
And the woman then brought you to Anti-Era?
Yeah, right. The woman must have brought me to Anti-Era. And then maybe Anti-Era and Mark and I went to Germany together. That's how it was. I think that's what happened. That we all went to Germany together. Yeah, yes, I'm pretty sure we did. Because when we got to Germany, they took us to a sanatorium in Sant'Ottilia, to a sanatorium where they kept the children, and they examined us, they deloused us, they did everything to us. And then they put us into this sanatorium, and they treated us beautifully. But at that point, we were already under the Americans. It's the American which we came to Germany, and near Munich, Germany. So it was Mark and myself and Eda, right? All three of us were there together.
And where did you, how long did you stay in the sanatorium?
They didn't keep us there very long. They just kept us a short time. And then what they did, we were put in a displaced person camp, Feldafink, where there were a lot of other displaced persons. And they had a special barrack only for children. And how they organized this particular only for children was Israelis came from Israel, and they organized all the Sherita Pleta, you know, all the survivors. And our kibbutz, they made it into like a kibbutz like in Israel, but of course this was in the DP camp. And it was wonderful. It was a very, very warm feeling in that kibbutz. It was a great feeling because you had other people. It was all like brothers and sisters. And I was really one of the youngest too. There were a few other young children, but I was one of the young ones. And Eda was very active. Eda was on the committee. Eda was very, very active there. And we learned Hebrew in that kibbutz. They taught us Hebrew. They taught us history. They tried to make as normal as life as they possibly can for us. And life was not bad. It really wasn't bad there. It wasn't. Now this was from 1945 till 46. About a year we lived in that kibbutz. And then what they were trying to do, they were trying to disperse all the kibbutzim and all the people because they were trying to take people to go to Israel. But at that time, of course, you couldn't go to Israel yet with legally either, because the British were there and they wouldn't let you in anyway. So somehow or another, my brother Mark got to go, and Eda and I stayed behind again. And we decided when the kibbutz was dispersed, we went to live with my sister Chane and my sister Mindel and this character over here. They were living already in Ufreiman, and so we stayed with them. And again, in the displaced person camp, they tried to make as normal a life for the children as possibly they could. I went to school there. They had a regular school because they had a lot of teachers. I went to school. I learned Hebrew, of course, and most of my subjects were in Hebrew. And I lived in that for maybe a half a year or so, till April of 47. And then one day I remember an officer, an American soldier came in, and he asked who wanted to go to America, or who was an orphan, or who could go to America, something like that. And I remember coming home and asking my sister Chane, and she at that time, you know, they were married already, and they had I think Larry was already born. No, Larry wasn't born. The twins were born. Mindel had already the twins. And they encouraged me to go. They said, absolutely. My uncle, Yermo, Uncle Jerry, who has died since, he encouraged me to go. He said, absolutely go to America. It's a wonderful Medina. It's a golden Medina. You know how people used to talk about America. The golden Medina, you gotta go, you gotta go. Well, again, I came and I told my sisters, and they had said, yes, absolutely go. So I went back the following day to school and I registered, but I had said that I would not go unless my sister Eda would go. I wouldn't go alone, and they actually wouldn't let me go alone either, you know. So that's how it came about that I came to America.
So how'd you get here?
How did you get to America?
Well, first of all, in order to get to America, you have to go through the American consulate. And I have a cute story to tell you about that one, too. We finally registered, and of course you had to wait a couple months in order for you to be cleared to get the visa and all the other papers. But on my right hand, I happened to have a very funny nail that never grew normally. And everybody in the DP camp said to me, oh, Reva, you'll never get there, because the minute they look at that nail, you won't make it. So my brother-in-law Shia at the time, being that he was a shoemaker, had this tremendous shoeman's file, one of those files, and he filed my nail so flat because they were afraid how stupid people were at that time. Thank God nobody even bothered to look at that nail. I just thought I'd put it in for humor's sake. Anyway, we went through the consulate, everything was fine, we got the papers, and 3 months later we were off to America. And that too was a very traumatic experience for me, because we were going to Bremenhaven by ship, of course, but before we got there, I remember my sister Mindel and Duvet and the twins, Joni and Sherry, were only 11 months old. My sister Hannah, Larry wasn't born yet, I don't think, or maybe he was a baby. And they all came to the train to say goodbye to us. And at that point...
What kind of train? Oh, she's talking here, I forgot. I'm sorry.
We said goodbye to them, and I never realized, at that point we really didn't know that if we would ever see them again, honestly. We just did not know. So we arrived at Bremenhaven, and Eda gets sick. Eda was having problems with her stomach. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? Eda is sick, they're going to leave her behind, and I'm going to have to go to America by myself. And there again I was frightened. Here I go again, somebody's leaving me behind again, you know? But thank God they were able to cure Eda. They gave her, what's that stuff they give for stomach problems? Castor oil. It's funny now. Going back, it's funny. Then it was not funny. Anyway, Eda was cured of it, and she felt much, much better, and we all got onto the ship. It was called the Marina Marlin ship. And of course, we were traveling for, I believe, 9 days it took us to go to America. And all the 9 days I was sick like a dog. I was absolutely, unbelievably sick. Actually, everybody on our trip was sick except Eda. Eda was the only one that was being able to watch over everybody and take care of everybody. I was so sick that it was, can't imagine me now telling you how sick I was then. But eventually we arrived to New York Harbor, and when we arrived, there was a committee to greet us from the Hayas, and each one gave us a sort of a piece of an identification card saying who we were. And I know that the women who greeted us, it must have been some Jewish organization. They were very, very nice, and they gave us hot cocoa and donuts and Bismarcks and things like that. And I always joke about it. I said, till today, I blame these women for my sweet tooth. They did that to me because they induced me or introduced me to eating sweets then. Anyway, we arrived and we had no problems. Our papers were checked, and finally they took us on a bus. It was already dusk, it was getting dark, and I remember driving through Manhattan. The lights were just unbelievable. I mean, it was like being in a fairyland. You just didn't know. You kept looking everywhere, and all you could see are these bright lights. And finally we arrived at our destination, to, I believe it was the Bronx. Now, it was either Brooklyn or the Bronx. I think it was the Bronx. And they had a settlement house. And they put us up in that settlement house. And when we arrived to the room, to the bedrooms where we were putting down our things, but before we arrived to New York, I have to go back a little bit. My sister Hannah had made for me like a suit, a pantsuit, like a Eisenhower jacket and some pants to match, and she made it out of a green blanket from a army blanket. And me, like a fool, instead of saving that particular item, I took it off and threw it in the ocean. And later on I was very, very sorry that I did that, because I really should have kept it. But this is another story. Anyway, we arrived in the evening, and they each showed us our rooms where to go. And as we got into our rooms, I remember on each bed there was an orange and a chocolate Hershey bar and a pair of pajamas size 42. I think at that time I must have worn maybe a 10. And the pajamas were naturally, they were not for women either, they were male for men. And they made us take showers and clean up and go to bed because we were very, very exhausted. And I also remember not eating the orange or the Hershey bar that night. I remember saving it. And then the following morning we got up and we went down to the dining room to eat. And I'll never forget that one either. They gave us cold milk with cereal. And being European, you weren't used to that kind of food, of course. And I looked at it and none of us ate it. I didn't eat. I remember not eating the cereal and the cold milk. But they must have had other food too, because I do remember eating toast and jam and eggs, scrambled eggs they had. And we were only in that settlement for about a week. And while we were in the settlement house, they took us touring the city. One man, there was a very wealthy man, I believe, came and took some of the children to dinner, to a restaurant. And once we went to I remember going to the Statue of Liberty. And I remember going, did we go to Central Park? And they gave us tours. They took us all over that particular week. And then from that point, they they took us all to Chicago. We were going to Chicago. What they did, they divided up the groups. So many would go to different cities. And there was a group, there was only 3 of us who went to Chicago, to the orphanage. And in Chicago, I was there for 6 weeks with Etta. And while we were in the orphanage, we would save every penny. We would get an allowance, $2 or so, I don't remember, maybe less. Very, very little allowance. And we would save every penny because we would buy groceries and send packages to Germany. Because Mindel and David were already in Israel, but my sister Hannah, I think they were already in Israel. 47, 48, yeah, they went 48 to Israel. So we would send packages, and like 2 fools, we would carry those boxes. Etta and I would carry them. And Etta would dole me out maybe 10 cents a day or so to buy myself an ice cream, because she knew how much I loved ice cream. And she would give me 10 cents or so. But another thing happened to me while I was in the orphanage. I got sick. I got diphtheria. I don't know if Etta didn't remember that. She didn't remember that. That's too bad. I got very sick when I came to the orphanage. I had diphtheria, and I had to be isolated and quarantined. And again, I was being alone and abandoned. I always had this feeling of always being abandoned. And I didn't understand the language. Nobody understood me, but I knew that I had to be isolated from everybody else. And Etta used to sneak in because she was not allowed, because she could have gotten sick. And Etta would sneak in and you know, like wave to me or say something to me, you know, I'm here and all of that. Etta did not remember that. That was a very dramatic time for me.
She did remember you being sick and isolated. She didn't say what it was that you had.
Oh, I had diphtheria.
She did.
Well, anyway, so that was a traumatic experience for both of us, for Etta and myself. It was very hard for us. And of course I got well. And then this was May of 1947. The school system was still going on because the school was over in June. So they wanted to put me right away in school because I was 13, almost 14 years old at the time, and they wanted me to right away start school. So they took me to school. One of the social workers from the orphanage took me to school, and they put me in a class with little children. I think at that time the children must have been kindergarten or first grade, I'm not sure. And all of a sudden they see this big girl in their class, and they don't probably know what's going on either. And the teacher asked the children if any of the children spoke Jewish or spoke Yiddish. And I did not understand very much then. I just knew a few words. I knew please and man and picture, just a few words of English because I had started learning English in Germany already. And all of a sudden this little girl, maybe she was 6 years old, raises her hand and she said that she speaks Yiddish. And so she says, well, say something to the girl. So she told me, geh schlafen. And I started to laugh, and I said, what is she saying to me, to go to sleep? That's about as far as the Yiddish went. So I went to school for about a month, from May till June. And then they found a foster home for me here in Minneapolis. And I came to Minneapolis July 2nd, 1947. And Etta was going someplace else. They found a separate home for Etta. Etta went to stay with some other people. I think at that time they used to call them boarding houses. And I lived with a foster home with the Lewises, Julia and Eli Lewis. And I remember being taken on the 4th of July to the North Commons Park in North Minneapolis. And those poor people, I frightened them half to death because I was frightened half to death. Because they were shooting, there were the fireworks. And all I kept remembering were the bombs and the shooting and the killing. And I started screaming. I was frightened so much that they got frightened because they did not understand what was happening to me. They probably thought they got a crazy girl here. Because people had warned them ahead of time not to take, not specifically me, but not to take any of us in, because they did not know what we come from, the kind of world that we were coming from. But she was very, very kind, and she did take me, and they were very, very good to me. I lived in the foster home for 2 years, almost 3 years actually, and I went to school. I went to Lincoln Junior High School, then I went to high school, vocational high school. I also went to the Talmud Torah. I graduated to Talmud Torah, and I became very, very active. I was an active, typical teenager, going to school. The only problem I had, I was a little bit more mature for my age because of the circumstances, what I had gotten through, the war, what the war had done to me. So even though I was only a 15-year-old girl, I could not really relate to a 15-year-old girl here or to a 15-year-old boy here because their lives were so different than my life. But I managed very nicely. And then one day, I believe, that is sort of vaguely in my mind, I really can't remember that very clearly. I'm sure Etta remembers it better. And I think Etta told me that she met a very nice boy, or I don't remember if Ben called me. I really and truly can't remember. But I do remember meeting Ben for the first time. My sister Etta fixed me up. I was only 15 years old. She fixed me up like a 20-year-old woman. She put on her dress. She gave me her printed black and floral dress. She put on a pink feather in my hair, high heels that were 3 inches tall, black suede high heel strap shoes. And I remember Ben coming to pick me up for a date. And where we went was to the prom, I think it's called the prom, I'm not sure. Is it the prom? Where they dance, they used to dance. And of course, Ben is a wonderful dancer, and I used to love to dance too. And we went out on the date. Mind you, we had no car. He picked me up, and we went by streetcar. Which you guys, 50 years from now or 40 years from now, probably won't know what the word streetcar means either. But we went on the streetcar, and I honestly have to admit now, after being married for 45 years to Ben, that I think it was love at first sight, and I think he said the same thing about me. I liked Ben from the minute I saw him, and he liked me too. It was like magic. I don't know what it was, but there was a certain feeling right away that I had for him and he had for me. And of course, couldn't be married 45 years if he didn't come back. So he came back, he called me again, and at that time the roller derby was very popular. And I used to love it. I loved it so much. And Ben and Vitek and Edda, we loved it. And we used to go together to the roller derbies. And then, of course, we had the world famous Lakers basketball. And Ben loved the Lakers, and we used to go to the Laker game. And I loved it. This was the most fun for me. And this was my romantic life with Ben.
I thought Ben played for the Lakers.
We had a pretty good romantic, for about 2.5 years. We dated each other. And of course I had to go, I was still in high school and I had to finish school. And then unfortunately, of course, the Korean War broke out after I got married. No, we got married in July 29, 1950. And
Is there anything that you'd like to say to your children or grandchildren?
what do I want to say to my children? Well, my children, as you know now, of course, are all grown up. They're having children of their own or had already children of their own. Gary, my youngest son, Gary and Stacy, are taping this film. And I can say that my biggest accomplishment in my life is raising 3 wonderful, wonderful children, which I've always been very, very proud of. They've always made me feel very proud. They've never given me a day that I regret of having them. I hope and pray that the time will come when their children will feel exactly the way I feel about them. I hope also in years to come, when I'm no longer here, and you look at these pictures, that you will know how much pain and sorrow has gone into this. And I hope that the world that you will live in will never have this kind of sorrow and hatred and bigotry, what the Jewish people have gone through. I also hope that you will continue with your Jewish heritage, that you will try your best that you possibly know how to make your parents and your grandparents very, very proud of you, that you are good human beings, that you are kind to one another, always take care of one another, because there is no such a thing. The most important thing in life is your family. No matter how wonderful and marvelous your friends are, and your grandma and grandpa have a lot of wonderful friends, but it's family that you have to count on, it's family that you have to stick by, and always, always remember to love one another, respect one another, trust one another, because without these 3 things, there is nothing much left. And my biggest legacy that I could possibly leave to you is just be good to your mother and father, be good to your parents, and when you eventually become parents, be good to everybody around you. Just remember that we always, always loved you, and we always will love you. No matter where I am, far and beyond, always remember us with good thoughts.